The market for weight loss drugs could reach $100 billion in the next 8 years. We're talking about GLP-1s in particular. It's the blockbuster takeaway from a Goldman Sachs note, which cited further uses of drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy beyond the current diet and diabetes treatments, saying they could become the highest grossing drugs of all time. Chris Shibutani was the co-author of that note from Goldman, and he's joining us right now. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. This is really interesting stuff. We've been talking about it a lot lately, so it's great to have you here with us. First of all, just talk to me about your analysis, how you get to that $100 billion by 2030.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, I think, the analysis starts with the reality that overweight and obesity is a condition that is quite ubiquitous. It is really a condition that affects currently over 100 million Americans, and worldwide is on another scale as well. Certainly sources such as the CDC, the World Health Organization, can verify this. There's also been a significant, progressive, noteworthy increase in that level of overweight and obesity in the US, and therefore it's a very significant problem. When we think about getting to a peak revenue kind of projection, it really begins with thinking about that kind of number, as well as patients who may be able to take these treatments durably over time. And that penetration is actually really quite modest currently, about 1% really, a little bit more than that when you consider off-label use of these drugs, and forecasting increased utilization of the current medicines, as well as next generation versions of them that will improve efficacy, make it more convenient as we go from injections to pills. You do the math there, and you can get to these pretty significant numbers that we've perhaps never seen in the pharma industry before.
Chris, what about the question of accessibility, which has been coming up quite a lot in terms of both the production issues that Novo Nordisk has been having with these drugs here in the U.S., as well as the cost and the insurance coverage, Medicare coverage, et cetera, of these drugs?
Yeah, two absolutely foundational questions. So as we often say, have to make the donuts. These are not simple pills and tablets, not yet at any rate. These are currently weekly injections, and they have to be very carefully packaged into syringes. The dose levels are very specific. This is a very carefully developed and designed process that takes quite a bit of sort of manpower and as well as manufacturing capacity. And of course, it's very closely and carefully regulated by the FDA from a patient safety standpoint. So thus far, the demand has significantly exceeded what Novo Nordisk was able to supply when they initially launched Wegovy, the branded version for obesity. Of course, they have Ozempic for diabetes as well. And Eli Lilly has a drug in a similar category, the GLP-1s, tirzepatide, that is available from Mounjaro. So both companies currently with approvals, at least for diabetes, and Lilly will soon be anticipated to also get an approval for obesity, are working very hard, almost certainly around the clock, to expand their manufacturing capacity. The second issue that you described, the cost and how these drugs will be paid for, is also really fundamental to our thinking in terms of how we get from the current levels to potentially the $100 billion revenue mark for the overall worldwide market in 2030. The cost currently of these drugs in the US, roundly about $1,000 a month for Ozempic for diabetes, and more, a higher price point, roughly about $1,300 per month. Comes out to about $15,000 per year in terms of the gross price, or kind of the manufacturer's suggested retail price, so to speak, for these drugs. And therefore, insurance coverage is extremely important. Right now, we have a mix of the population, some whom have private insurance, but a very significant proportion of what we would describe as people who might be eligible to take these based upon the fundamental criteria, such as their body mass index or BMI, or the additional qualifier, so to speak, from what we think about these labels of having comorbid conditions, risks of other diseases that are associated with being overweight, like heart disease and whatnot. These are the criteria that often involve patients who will rely upon the government's insurance, Medicare and Medicaid, which very relevantly does not currently cover these medicines. So the journey from here to that $100 billion mark in 2030 will very importantly include the necessary calculus of getting insurance coverage, because these drugs are at the price points that I described.
Chris, I also have to ask about risks, because as you point out in your note, you've covered this industry for a long time. we have seen this movie before where there have been so-called miracle drugs that then have turned out, I think of fen most notably, that then have turned out to have adverse effects enough that in that case it ended up going away, right, and not being used any longer. How do we sort of, especially as lay people, I know you are not, but I am, how do we figure out the possible risks of that kind of thing happening with this class of drugs?
Extremely important question. With every therapeutic, for any condition, obviously you're looking at two dimensions. Does it work, efficacy, and is it safe, and is it tolerable? And in particular, when we're thinking about a drug that could become available for such a significant portion of the population, you really do need to have a very high bar in terms of safety and tolerability. You point to historical drugs that have indeed have notorious track records for being quite promising on the efficacy front, managing to get through certain rites of passage as far as demonstrating that they can do kind of what the FDA would be requiring them to do, show that, for instance, you can lose weight. But until you get beyond the parameters of, say, a carefully constructed and executed clinical trial and out into the real world with all of its complicating factors, including the far broader range of the population who may be taking these and may have other conditions, safety is mission critical. Now, with the GLP-1s, we are coming with equipment of about a decade of experience because these drugs, earlier iterations and up to the current ones, have been broadly utilized in diabetes. There's a lot of overlap and tangency between overweight, obesity, and diabetes. For many patients, this is a coexisting problem. And it is this track record, essentially this kind of library or memory bank of safety experience that has given meaningful reassurance that these drugs, while not perfect, are ready, in essence, for prime time. I think that is one of the key gating factors that have made this so top of mind in terms of the potential for these drugs to go beyond to realms where perhaps some of these earlier generations of drugs had shortcomings.
Very interesting, Chris. And finally, just quickly here, as we've been talking about, it's Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly that are developing and selling these drugs. For an investor, are there any other names they should be watching that might have potential offerings as well?
I think investors need to pay attention to companies that have offerings. And for there, I would name, for instance, Amgen, covered by my colleague Salveen Richter, Pfizer, which is a name that we cover. Other smaller companies are also developing assets in similar or related categories. We published a report 2 weeks prior to our basics report that we're discussing here that identified over 50 drugs worldwide from different biotech and pharmaceutical companies that are in the clinic, the term that we phrase for managing to get into human clinical studies to demonstrate whether they can stand up and meet the bar of efficacy as well as safety. So there's plenty to watch for investors across the biotech spectrum. And clearly as well, what we're seeing is the next derivative question. If these drugs are in fact so transformational, what are the knock-on effects within healthcare, from medical devices and healthcare services and insurance companies, as well as beyond? So this is the first chapter of a very expansive story, and look forward to being able to continue to talk with you about it.
Yes, and we look forward to that as well. Really clear analysis here of this very big and hot topic right now. Chris Shibutani from Goldman Sachs, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.